Hi, this is Grandma here, and I'm reading chapter 3 called Air Knockers. Now remember, I don't really speak the language, but I have looked up the pronunciations of some of these words, and I'm doing my best. Also, there is a little bit of Spanish, and although I know what the Spanish means, the pronunciation may not be great on that either. Anyway, we start the chapter off with a picture of an airplane and a family with a mom, a dad, and two little boys. Those two little boys are Ronnie and Terry, and their mom and dad are missionaries in the jungles of Peru. Soon Dad was off to find the Machiguengas, and he ended up in Timpia, which was about as far from anywhere as you can get. If you've ever heard of Timpia, you're either an avid reader of National Geographic, an intrepid Urubamba River explorer, or a friend of ours. Timpia was a pain to get to. It definitely wasn't on the way from anywhere to anywhere else. Its two thatched houses were perched on a high bank over the Timpia River, near where it emptied into the Urubamba River, one of the fast-flowing tributaries of the Ucayali River, and eventually the Amazon. Floating north down the Urubamba to Timpia were from the ancient ruins of Machu Picchu and Quillabamba was next to impossible, although a few Machiguengas tried it, and some even survived to tell about it. The main obstacle was a treacherous gorge full of foaming white rapids, spinning whirlpools, and swirling cross currents. Balsa rafts could come down it with a moderate chance of not doing cartwheels or shattering into toothpicks, but it wasn't something you wanted to do very often. Dugout canoes, which would be from trees, were even riskier. Getting 500 miles upriver to Timpia by boat from Pucallpa, the closest real town downriver, was certainly possible if you had a half a lifetime to do it. Few people wanted to get there that badly. Fortunately, by the time Dad went to Timpia, SIL had an Aeronca float plane. They could fly him on the way there. Now, SIL, I've written in the back because he uses that abbreviation often. It means Summer Institute Linguistics. And that's the company that he works for, which is a part of the Bible translation group. All the Indians fled into the jungle when the plane pulled up on the bank, but one tall, skinny man with a drooping black mustache came to greet Dad. Buenos dias, Walter Snell, a sus órdenes. Dad stuck out his hand, used his middle name because Wayne sounds like whiny when you say it in Spanish. He basically said, "Good day, Walter Snell at your service." Now the man with the black mustache responds, "Juan Mendoza, mucho gusto, buenvenido, and a Timpia." It turned out he was a very bright Spaniard with an engineering degree from Harvard, far removed from his native land. Apparently, he had gotten into some sort of political trouble in Spain and had exiled himself to Peru, ending up in Timpia of all places. And what he said in English was, "Nice to meet you, welcome to Timpia." Who all lives here? Dad wanted to know. There were only 2 houses in the small clearing, and it seemed an unlikely place to meet a Spaniard. There are about a dozen adults that all live in that one big house, plus all of their children, Don Juan answered. They work for me, clearing land and planting crops. What kind of stuff do you grow? Mostly rice and a poisonous plant they use downriver to manufacture insecticides. I don't make a lot of money from it, but it's a living, and I don't need much money out here. He smiled as he glanced around at the surrounding jungle, hundreds of miles from any stores. After the small talk was over, Dad got to the real point of his visit. My wife and I would like to learn Machiguenga. Where do you think would be the best place for us to live while we're doing that? Legally, Don Juan didn't own the area, but he knew a lot about the Machiguengas. It wouldn't have been smart to just barge in. Oh, please come and live here in Tympia. You're welcome to build your own house and bring your family. I'd be happy to have your company here and help you in any way I can. What he meant was that he'd be thrilled to talk to someone who had heard of Spain and Harvard. Tympia seemed like an awfully small place to begin working, but it was as large a community as the Machiguengas had. So, wanting to capitalize on the warm welcome, Dad flew back out in November to build us a house. Before he left, he loaded bulky equipment, including a kerosene refrigerator for my milk, a hand-crank washing machine for my diapers, and a hand-crank sewing machine on a motor launch. The launch would take it to Atalaya, about halfway by river. From there, a small plane would pick it up and transfer it to Tympia someday. That process took a full 5 months. On Don Juan's orders, the Indians had already cleared a spot for our new house by the time Dad got there. It sat on a high hill above the river, close to the foothills of the Andes Mountains, with the fabulous views, both the sunrise and sunset. Our first tribal home would be one of the most beautiful in the jungle. Dad stayed there 5 weeks. When he came home, he had lost 35 pounds and had gained a beard, plus amoeba and a few other intestinal parasites. And the amoeba and the parasites is the reason he's lost 35 pounds. They make you sick to your stomach. So the food doesn't stay in your system very long. In April, it was our turn. Colleagues huddled on the bank to pray as Mom contemplated 6 months of isolation with 2 little boys. Dad had once again gone out ahead of us, so it was just Mom, Terry, me, and the pilot in the little Aeronca plane, affectionately known as Air Knocker, or Knocker for short. Knockers were canvas-covered planes designed to fly with more or less a 440-pound load. SIL's Knockers were on floats, which made it pretty difficult to get a full load into the air, since those floats are part of the 440 pounds. Section between the water and the floats kept the plane from getting up on step or planing, and the only way to break the suction was to rock the plane back and forth. Sometimes the pilot tried to get one float out of the water before the other, divide and conquer, push the stick in and out and turn it. If the plane didn't get off before the engine overheated or it ran out of room, the pilot slowed back down, turned around, rested a few minutes, and tried again. In later years, I thought that was the most fun of the whole trip, and I was always a bit disappointed when we finally succeeded. Pilots differed in their ability to get knockers off the water. One pilot, whose name I won't mention, often roared back and forth, until eventually he'd used up enough fuel to lighten the load and get airborne. So now we know that 440 pounds also includes fuel. And what that pilot did was he used up some of the fuel, and that made him light enough to get aloft. Crazy. By then, he sometimes didn't have enough to get where he was going. That's the downside to using up the fuel on takeoff. I don't remember our first trip to Tympia, but I do remember many just like it. Uncle Jim Price was our pilot. Uncle Jim with bare feet, tattered trousers, and a stained t-shirt and unruly hair. He was a jack of all trades and a master of most. Uncle Jim loved Aeroncas, and could make them do everything but fetch and roll over. Maybe he could make them roll over, but if so, he never told anyone. It wouldn't have been well received by our aviation administrators. He certainly never rolled an Avianca when my mom was on board. She would have strangled him with his seatbelt. Folklore has it that Uncle Jim once landed an Avianca on Lake Yaranacacha with so little fuel that it ran out before he could taxi in. Swimming spectators watched him calmly paddle it home. I think he finally quit flying when they started making rules about safety. In spite of Uncle Jim's expertise and our colleagues' prayers, it still took 3 tries to get us off the lake in Yaranacacha. Since we were loaded to the max, we were always loaded to the max. In this case, our load included 2 fully screened cribs for Terry and me, probably made out of mahogany because it was so cheap and easy to get. We also had 5-gallon cans of cookies and crackers, canned vegetables and fruit, baby formula, office supplies, and reel-to-reel tape recorders for language study. Boxes of medicine, a 2-way radio about the size of an apartment refrigerator, a generator to run the radio, and miscellaneous boxes and bags and bundles. Roaring like a pride of lions, we finally lifted off, and Mom waved goodbye to friends she didn't plan to see for 6 months. As usual, there was no room for seats. So Mom sat on a lumpy green duffel bag, and I sat on her. I don't remember if she was lumpy and green, but one can assume so given the turbulent tropical air. It took 5 hours to get 350 air miles to Olympia. Aviancas weren't particularly fast. And we had to stay in sight of the river's winding route in case engine trouble forced us back down on the water. In a float plane, being forced down on the river was a minor interruption. Being forced down anywhere else could ruin the whole trip because they don't have wheels. They have floats. They're meant to land on water, not on land. The view from the little windows was of rivers and jungles and rivers and jungles, and for 5 hours, rivers and jungles. The Amazon rainforest stretched endlessly in every direction. An unbroken ocean of green broccoli splotched here and there with red or yellow. Once in a long while, a translucent feather of smoke marked a tiny hut in a little clearing beside the river. Now, do you think that was really green broccoli, or did it just the trees looked like broccoli? I think the trees just looked like broccoli. I don't think it was really broccoli. Our only stop was in Atalaya, a frontier military outpost where the Tambo and Urubamba rivers joined to form the Ucayali. Big launches could get that far upriver, carrying 55-gallon barrels of aviation fuel that they stockpiled on the bank. The men who helped Uncle Jim roll the barrels of gas down to the plane were quite captivated by the 2 little boys who emerged for a wiggle. Mom understood enough Spanish by then to know that they were taking bets on how long our white skin would last when the river gnats attacked us in Olympia. It wasn't a reassuring conversation, and as it turned out, they had good reason to be concerned. Taking off from a river was even more exciting than taking off from the lake. Uncle Jim had to hand crank the propeller to start the engine, clamber aboard the slippery float without getting his head chopped off, squeeze into the cockpit, yell at his helpers to turn the plane and push it away from the bank, and hope that the engine didn't cut out before he took off. Sometimes it did. And he'd have to paddle like fury or scramble back to the front of a float for more cranking while the current carried the plane downriver. Of course, it took a few tries again to get off the water after refueling in Atalaya. Mom rocked with the plane, subconsciously trying to help it, and we rocked with Mom since we were still sitting on her. Once back in the air, we turned further south and followed the Urubamba. Underneath us, the jungle got more and more interesting. At first, little lumps, then genuine hills, and finally rugged bamboo-covered cliffs and mountains broke up the landscape. The muddy beaches downriver gave way to sandy and rocky beaches upriver. Instead of endless clay banks, we flew over red cliffs cut bare by the rushing river. The Urubamba was clear and fast instead of sluggish and brown. Slowly we gained altitude as we approached the edge of the Andes and the mouth of the Timpia River, 1,450 feet above sea level. At last, Uncle Jim pointed out the tiny clearing in the middle of the endless jungle and the gray-brown palm-leafed roof of the huge communal house where all the Machiguengas lived together. There was another house some distance away. That would be Don Juan's house. In between these two was the only other house in the area. It looked tiny from the air and still had a dark green roof of new leaves. Dad had just built it for us. We touched down and skipped along the surface until Uncle Jim cut the engine, then taxied up beside dugout canoes tied to the bank, where Dad and Don Juan were waiting with big smiles on their faces. Only a handful of men and boys were brave enough to join them beside the river. They weren't smiling. Most of the welcoming party wore long, coarse, reddish-brown kushma robes made of homespun cotton. A couple had smudgy red paint on their faces. The men had what looked like headbands, holding down neatly trimmed bangs that hung right down past their eyebrows, pretty much hiding their eyes in dark shadows. As it turns out, the bangs were shiny black feathers that perfectly matched the Indians' hair. Beyond the brave men and boys who risked their lives to meet us, more cautious men, women, and children hid in the bushes and trees high on the banks, waiting to see what sort of aliens would climb out of that bright yellow UFO. To be on the safe side, they were ready to run for their lives. Now, you know it's not really a UFO, it's the airplane they're talking about. Expectations of a fabulous show ran high and no one was disappointed. When Mom handed Terry and me out the door of the plane, covert, secret giggles and murmurs of wonder rippled through the bushes. Dad introduced each of us by pointing and saying our names. Mom was Signora Betty. Terry was Terry. I was and forever remained Ronnie, which we would call Ronnie. We and our considerable baggage were dumped on the rocky beach in front of our new home. Once unloaded, it took a lot of help to get us up the 100-foot bank in that first time. Dad, scrambling for a footing in the loose shale, carried me. Victor, the head man of the small group of Machiguengas living there, awkwardly carried Terry. Victor clearly would have been more comfortable running up the steep, slippery bank with a 15-gallon barrel of kerosene on his shoulders. Little boys were for women to carry. Watching Mom climb the bank, everyone wondered just what was wrong with her. She couldn't see obvious footholds, couldn't get any traction, couldn't make any progress even though she kept flopping around and grabbing at things. It was pretty clear that if she didn't get some help, she'd spend the rest of her life on the rocky beach. Unfortunately, it was totally inappropriate for a Machiguenga man to help her, and the women were still hidden high in the bushes. Finally, Don Juan, the gallant Spaniard, came to her rescue. Pulling on one end, pushing on the other, he coaxed her thrashing legs slowly up the hill, while everyone else ran past carrying our belongings and discreetly laughing. The puzzled Machiguengas couldn't figure out why we were there, nor could they understand how we would survive. We couldn't even go up a bank by ourselves or say anything intelligible. Oh well, for now it didn't really matter. This was going to be a great show. So that's the end of chapter 3. And chapter 4 is called Timpia, which is the name of the village they live in, but it has a very good picture of Ronnie and Terry, the two boys. I imagine they looked very odd to these Indians in the Peruvian jungles. Now, I don't know if you noticed the technique that was used in this book. We've gone through 3 chapters. The first chapter was very exciting about 2 young boys going down the river. And after that, it was more about how they got there and what their jobs were going to be and how they were different from the Indians. What the author did here is the first chapter grabbed our attention and we wanted to know more. We wanted more exciting stories like that. But he felt like he really needed to tell how they got there. So we've just gone through some chapters that were maybe a little bit boring. But I have a feeling that the chapters are going to get exciting again. Okay, bye-bye.